All right, hello class, and thank you so much for tuning in today. So today's class actually marks a pretty important transition in the course of this semester, as we're leaving behind Unit 1, which is focused on getting a broad empirical understanding of intergenerational mobility in the United States and around the world, and we move forward into Unit 2, which is about understanding the role of the family in maintaining economic advantages, right, in transmitting economic advantages to children. And one of the most important parts of this transition is that moving forward, we're going to be using economic theory, formal economic models, to try to understand intergenerational mobility. So the next couple of lectures are going to be purely focused on building and thinking through models of the family and what they can tell us about intergenerational mobility. So before I get into the math, I just want to spend a moment talking about why this might be a useful thing to do, right? Why economic theory is helpful to us if we want to understand mobility or any other set of questions. And I know that all of you have done and seen economic theory before, right? You all have a certain baseline on this, but I think we can sometimes be not careful enough in talking about why we're doing what we're doing, what the advantages of this are as a way of understanding the world. So in the simplest form, I think economic theory is really just a form of very, very careful and explicit storytelling. When we lay out a model, what we're essentially doing is introducing a group of characters and being very, very specific about their motivations, their abilities, their constraints. And then we're using formal reasoning, right, which we crystallize into math, to say, given the set of motivations we've given our characters, given the set of options we've given our characters, what can we conclude is going to happen when they all interact with each other? And if we do it right, we should be able to prove for sure that the assumptions of our model lead to certain conclusions, right? So in the world of our model, in the story that we're telling, we can know for sure why each character is acting the way they do, and how changes in those assumptions we make are going to change our conclusions. Now, how is this useful for understanding the real world, which doesn't follow the rules of our very simplified, idealized models? I think it can do a couple things. The first thing is that it can help us tie together a bunch of empirical findings that, without being careful about economic theory, can be difficult to understand together, right? So for example, in the paper we saw last time, we looked at, we compared intergenerational mobility in the United States and Denmark. We saw that wage inequality in Denmark is much, much smaller than wage inequality in the United States, but wealth inequality is much larger, and inequality of inheritances is much larger. So is that a weird, surprising conclusion? Or should we expect that low levels of wage inequality should lead to greater levels of wealth inequality? Creating a formal economic model of transmission of wealth from parents to children should be able to help us understand that sort of question. Or likewise, right, it can help us not make misinterpretations of empirical findings. So, when we looked at Chetty's paper on intergenerational mobility and race, one of the things that we talked about was, should we really expect that if there was no separate effect of being a racial minority on income, conditional on parent socioeconomic status, should we really expect that, for example, black women and white women should earn the same amount on average if their parents earn the same amount of money, right? Should we expect the A's and B's we estimate in the Chetty model to be the same by race if in the children's generation there was no separate effect of racial discrimination? A formal economic model can help us answer that question, can help us tell us, yes, we should expect that, or no, we shouldn't expect that. And as a result, that can protect us from drawing spurious conclusions from that sort of data exploration. And there's a great example of that, which you might have missed in Becker's work, where he talks about work by Jensen in 1969, looking at what's called compensatory education, which is essentially, this is a series of studies where one child in a family was given access to really high quality education to try to bring them up to grade level, right? When both kids in the family are below grade level. The other child in the family was not. And the finding of these papers tended to be that the sibling that got the high quality education didn't see much of an improvement relative to the sibling that didn't get high quality education. Becker says in this model, if we think carefully about the motivations of parents, right, who are distributing resources between their two parents, we might not draw the conclusion that the authors of that study drew was that compensatory education was a failure, that giving high quality education to children below grade level doesn't do anything. Becker says that's a spurious conclusion because we ought to expect that when a parent has one child getting higher quality education in school, the parent's going to direct more of their own investments towards their other child, if parents care about fairness between their children or about equality between their children. So that's just one example of A situation where the conclusions that we draw might become very different if we think carefully with economic theory. Now, of course, economic theory, economic modeling, is just one of many ways that we can try to do this, right? That we can try to build an intellectual framework that helps us interpret the things that we observe in the world around us. We could also do this, if we're interested in parents and children, by conducting careful interviews with a small number of families to help us understand those families' motivations and use those to draw broader conclusions about socioeconomic data. Right? We could do more expansive literary theory, right, which was common in the field of economics prior to the 1900s, and is still the dominant way of doing theory in most social sciences and humanities, right, where instead of writing down formal economic models, mathematical models, we spend our time exploring in a more humanistic way the motivations and drivers that might be leading to different, aggregate economic outcomes, observable economic outcomes. And, of all these different approaches, the advantage of economic theory, the advantage of using formal math in the way we're going to do, is that it can be very clear and specific. The disadvantage is that we're going to have to think through explanations of the world that are extremely stripped down and extremely simple. And so we're going to leave out a lot of stuff that we would love to be able to include in a real understanding of families. Okay, so with all that said, right, about economic theory, this is a discussion we'll be having throughout the semester. Just wanted to get us started. I also just wanted to note that this particular theory that we're working through today, Becker's theory of the family, is very, very important in the history of economics, because Becker was one of the first economists to use these tools of economic theory, right, that we use to understand things like market mechanisms, price setting, firm dynamics, etc., to try to understand more sociological questions. Questions like the way that the internal dynamics of families work, or the role of discrimination in the labor market. And so in a lot of ways, we owe a massive intellectual debt to the theory that we're laying out today, right? This is the starting point to a lot of modern economic explorations that think about things like power dynamics within romantic couples, or relationships between parents and children, or the role of altruism or guilt or love in economic relationships. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of understanding this thing. Now, Becker's primary goal in laying out this theory is understanding how parents decide how much to invest in their children. And as a result, how children's incomes are going to depend on parents' incomes. And he does this by asking a couple of questions. One is, what is the intentional, explicit, and costly investment parents are going to make in their children? In other words, what kinds of sacrifices are parents going to make for their children? And what governs that? Another is, what are the ways that parents effortlessly transmit advantages to children? Right? For example, by allowing their children to inherit their social network, or having their children grow up speaking the same language as their parents. And then the last is, given that parents are going to invest in their children, how do parents decide what particular way to help their children, right? How do parents decide when to invest in their children's schooling to help their children earn more in the future, and when to provide inheritances to their children? And he does all of this from an incredibly abstract 10,000 miles up in the air perspective that allows him to say that he's identifying basic processes that should govern the relationships between parents and children across all societies and across all time. So what I'm going to be doing today is laying out some very slightly simplified versions of those core models that Becker presents in his work. And we're going to start with probably the simplest one, which is, although it's still not that simple, but the simplest model, where parents just have a single way to invest in their children. They're simply deciding, how much of my income do I consume now? How much of my income do I leave for my children so they'll have it when they become adults? So Becker's going to think about this by writing down a model with really just two actors in it, with the roles shuffling generation by generation. And those actors are the parent, who he calls Generation T, and the child, who's Generation T plus 1. And for now, we're going to think about families where there's one parent and there's one child. Right? Now, in his model, the parent essentially makes all the decisions, and then the child becomes the parent and their resources depend on what their parent decided to do. Right? So when we think about transmission of resources from generation to generation, each link is just each parent deciding what their child is going to have. So he thinks about this by saying that the parent is only going to care about two things. Right? So the utility of the parent is going to depend on two factors. The first is the consumption the family gets in generation T, CT. And the second is going to be the income that the child ends up with when the child becomes an adult, IT plus 1. And he says, let's imagine that these preferences are going to be fairly simple. He says we're going to have homothetic preferences, which is just a slightly more general version of Cobb-Douglas preferences. So we're just going to use Cobb-Douglas preferences. And we'll say that the way that these preferences are going to look is that the utility is going to be given by the log of CT plus some alpha times the log of IT plus 1. As you thought about in your problem sets, right? This alpha can be thought of as essentially how important it is to the parent that their child have a high income once the child becomes a parent. Now, another thing to notice here is that the parent here cares about the child's income, not the child's consumption. So we can think about their preferences over the child's income to include any preferences they have for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren to be wealthier. So if these are the parent's preferences, all we need to know to finish our model, right, to know what the parent's going to do, is going to be to know their constraints, right, to know what their choices are going to be over CT and IT plus 1. And Becker says, let's do a couple things to build this. The first is to say that the parent has an income right now called IT. Right, so these are preferences. Now we're going to talk about constraints. The parent has an income IT, and the parent can use that income for two things. They can either buy consumption today, or they can invest in their child. Right, so we're going to say CT, I have definitions over here. Right, CT is in consumption today. IT is the parent income. IT plus 1 is child income. And YT is parent investment. Cool. So if this is the parent's budget, then the question is, what determines the child's income? And Becker's going to say the child's income is going to be determined by a couple of things. So IT plus 1 is going to be equal to, first of all, the investment that the parent made in the child times an interest rate, 1 plus R. Right, so the idea here is I put money in an index fund for my child, or GameStop bonds, or whatever I want to do, right? Stocks, what am I saying? When my child becomes an adult, they're going to get what I gave them plus some interest. But the child's also going to have income given by two different types of luck. So the first we're going to call ET plus 1 for endowment, and the second we're going to call mu T plus 1. So we've got an interest rate, which is given by R. ET plus 1, we're going to call the child's endowment. And this is essentially going to capture any sort of advantages that we might expect to be transmitted from parents to children effortlessly. This might include genetics, right? Things like height. It's also going to include things like the accent that you grow up speaking, the friends that your parents have that they give you, right? The social norms that you grow up with, that you expect because your parents have them. Maybe even things like your taste in food, right? That if your parents eat certain diets, you're likely to enjoy that diet yourself, right? All of these sorts of characteristics that are passed on from parents to children without the parents necessarily having to do anything about it. And then this mu, Becker just calls market luck. we can think of this mu as something like idiosyncratic differences in people's income that are going to end up advantaging or disadvantaging a child, right? So you just so happen to have a freshman year college roommate who starts a startup that turns into Instagram. You end up becoming very, very wealthy, right? You happen to have, your house burned down and lose a lot of your money, right? You happen to marry someone who is an extremely good match for you, makes your life great, right? Anything like this is going to affect this mu. It doesn't come from your parents. And collectively, this is the whole model, right? We know what the parent wants. We know what the parent can do, right? They can choose to consume or to invest in their child. We know how that investment is going to affect their child's future income. So all we have to do now is turn this problem into a problem with a conventional looking budget constraint and then solve it like any other consumer optimization problem.